Most people know of the story of the Titanic from James Cameron's epic 1997 film starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. But there is so much more to that story, such as the poor design of the ship, the deadly mistake of not having enough lifeboats on board, and the hubris of those involved with the creation and journey that caused over 1,500 people to lose their lives. Cheekily known as the Millionaire Special due to the amount of affluent and wealthy individuals on board, it took 3 years to build the ship and less than 3 hours for it to sink into the freezing depths of the Atlantic Ocean. This is the first episode about the luxury steamship Titanic and her first and last fateful journey. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class podcast. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. The Titanic was built as a product of competition between shipping lines in the beginning of the 20th century. The White Star Line was rivaling against a British firm called Cunard that had 2 ships that were considered to be the most elegant and luxurious ships of its time. The first ship was called the Mauretania, that started service in 1907 and set the speed record for the fastest average speed across the Atlantic, going at 23.69 knots. It held that title for 22 years. Cunard's other ship was called the Lusitania, which was also launched in 1907 and was known for having gorgeous interiors. However, it was hit by a torpedo by a German U-boat on May 7, 1915. The disaster killed 1,200 people of the 1,959 on board. This was essentially the catalyst for the United States entering World War I. The chief executive of White Star, J. Bruce Ismay, wanted to have 3 large ships constructed, which he discussed with William J. Peary, chairman of Harland and Wolff, a shipbuilding company. Ismay wanted each ship to measure 882 feet in length and 92 feet at the widest part. It was 170 feet high and displaced 66,000 tons of water. It also had a carrying capacity of 46,328 tons, and the fully laden ship weighed more than 52,000 tons. Work began in March 1909 at the shipyard of Harland and Wolff in Belfast, Ireland, the work going nonstop for 2 years. Titanic had 2 sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic. On May 31, 1911, the huge Titanic hull was moved into the River Logan in Belfast. It was the largest man-made object in the world. There was 100,000 people that went to the launch, and it took about a minute and went smoothly. The hull was then towed to a fitting out dock, where the next year was spent building the decks, creating the glamorous interiors, and installing 29 enormous boilers for her 2 steam engines. There are some deadly flaws that the Titanic had, the first one being the 15 watertight bulkhead compartments. Each compartment had electrical, watertight doors that could be closed and opened individually or all at once. The bulkheads were considered to be practically unsinkable, the issue with this being that the walls between the bulkheads extend a couple feet over the waterline, so the water can go from one compartment to the next. This might happen especially if the ship begins to lurch forward or lean over to one side. There were also not enough lifeboats on the Titanic. There were only 16 boats and 4 Engelhardt collapsibles. These boats could hold 1,178 people, and the Titanic could hold 2,435 passengers and 900 crew members, which meant that it was about 3,300 people. The number of lifeboats actually exceeded the British Board of Trade's requirements, but still meant that only 1/3 of the total people on board could be saved. The lifeboats were standard at that time. It was a wooden vessel that was 30 feet long, 9 feet wide, had yellow planking, oak, and elm. The Engelhardts were 27 feet long and 8 feet wide. The Titanic departed on its maiden voyage, leaving the dock at Southampton, England on April 10, 1912. It had 2 stops, one in Cherbourg, France, and the other one in Queenstown, now known as Cove, Ireland. It had 2,240 passengers and crew on board. Many of the individuals were high-ranking. The Titanic had been nicknamed the Millionaire's Special, and even Captain Smith was nicknamed the Millionaire's Captain because he was popular with the wealthy passengers. There were wealthy industrialists, dignitaries, celebrities, including the White Star Line's managing director J. Bruce Ismay, the person behind the inception of the Titanic. He was also with Thomas Andrews, the builder of the ship from Harland and Wolff. Interestingly enough, and in a decision that saved his life, J.P. Morgan, the financier behind the Titanic, was not on board. He had canceled at the last minute due to business. His International Mercantile Marine Shipping Trust had control over White Star Line and had been the one to personally select Ismay as a company officer. John Jacob Astor IV, the heir to the fortune of the Astor family, was the wealthiest passenger. He had a bit of a scandal in the recent year as he had divorced his wife, then immediately married Madeline Talmadge Force, an 18-year-old woman that was 29 years his junior. There was also the owner of Macy's, Isidore Straus, his wife Ida, and Benjamin Guggenheim, the industrialist. He was accompanied by his mistress, valet, and chauffeur. There was also the heiress, Margaret Brown, also known as the Unsinkable Molly Brown. The employees that were hired to attend to the first class were mostly traveling in second class. In second class, there were also academics, tourists, and journalists. The service in second class was said to be as good as first class was on most ships. Also, an interesting and disturbing statistic: first-class passengers were about 44% more likely to survive the sinking than the second and third-class passengers were. There were more than 700 passengers in third class, which exceeded both first and second-class passengers in terms of volume. Some passengers would only pay about $20 to make the crossing in the Titanic, whereas first-class passengers could pay up to $4,700 for a ticket. The third class was the biggest source of profit for shipping lines, such as White Star, and these accommodations were designed to be superior to any other third-class accommodations at the time. At the time of the departure, a few odd and perhaps ominous things happened. There was a small coal fire in one of the bunkers. While this does sometimes unfortunately occur, the blaze was taken care of immediately. The captain and chief engineer decided that the probability of there being damage to the hull was 0 to none, and they decided to continue on with the trip. There is a theory that the fire did actually get out of control and the crew had to attempt a full-speed crossing, so the collision with the iceberg was inevitable. Another ominous event that occurred was when the Titanic was leaving the dock. She almost collided with the America Line's SS New York. Some Titanic buffs feel that it was an omen and one of the worst kind to occur to a ship on its maiden voyage. When sailing across the Atlantic, the sea was calm and the skies were clear, but the moon was not bright. There had been a couple reports received of ice that had been spotted by other ships. Captain Edward J. Smith was unaware of how progressively more serious the warnings had become, as he had retired to his cabin at 9:20 p.m. Some of the warnings never made it to the bridge. Captain Smith had altered the course a little farther south to avoid icebergs, but the ship was still going around the speed of 22 knots. The two wireless radio operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, had been receiving these warnings, but they had also been receiving messages for passengers as well. At 9:40 p.m., the Mesaba had warned the Titanic of an ice field, but the message never got to the bridge. At 10:55, the Leyland liner, the Californian, which was near the Titanic, also sent out another warning that it had to stop due to being surrounded by ice. Phillips had scolded the Californian for interrupting him while trying to handle messages for passengers. The lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, didn't have binoculars, so they could not see anything until it was right ahead of them. The calm night, which seems like a plus, actually worked against them as they could not see the water lapping against the base of the icebergs. A little over 2 hours later, at 11:30 p.m., one of the lookouts spotted the iceberg dead ahead. He rang the warning bell at 11:40. First Officer William Murdoch ordered for the engines to be reversed and the ship to turn sharply hard a starboard. They did not want to make direct impact, but rather attempt to graze along its side to prevent further damage. 37 seconds after the warning had gone out, the ship hit the iceberg. It dropped chunks of ice onto the forward deck as the Titanic skid by it. The lookouts believed that there was actually no collision at all, having no knowledge that there was a 300-foot gash in the hull below the waterline. And until the 1980s, the belief was that there was an enormous gash, and it was widely believed to be true. There are many experts that believe that the Titanic had turned slower when the engines were reversed, that the Titanic would have likely stayed afloat if it had hit the iceberg head-on. As the captain and Thomas Andrews looked around the area that was damaged, 5 watertight compartments were already filling up and the bow was starting to pitch forward, which meant that the water from the full bulkheads were starting to pour into the other compartments. Andrews stated that the Titanic will likely stay afloat for about another hour and a half. The captain told the crew to start loading the lifeboats at 12:05 a.m., and 5 minutes later, he asked the wireless operators to send out distress calls. About an hour after the ship hit the iceberg, the first lifeboat was lowered. It was built to hold 65 people, but it only held 28. This would become standard as there was so much confusion and the ship was thrown into hectic chaos that left several lifeboats underfilled. Women and children, according to the law of the sea, were boarded first. Only when there were no women and children nearby could the men start to get on the lifeboats. However, many victims that ended up dying, drowning, or freezing to death were women and children. The Titanic stayed afloat for 3 hours. With all of the chaos, there were many people who had to be separated from their families, saying goodbye to their loved ones for the last time. Some people gave up their seats in lifeboats so that they could be with their loved ones until the end. Only 706 people out of 2,240 passengers and crew survived the sinking. At 1 a.m., water reached the base of the grand staircase on the E deck, and many male passengers, in a panic, were trying to board lifeboat 14, causing 5th Officer Harold Lowe to fire his gun 3 times. J. Bruce Ismay helped load some of the boats, and then later he went on to a collapsible as it was being lowered down. He stated that there were no women and children nearby when he stepped aboard the collapsible, but this move ended up destroying his reputation. There were also witnesses that stated that there were women and children nearby, and he ignored them. I want to talk about J. Bruce Ismay for a moment, as he is one of the most vital people within this story, and may have even indirectly caused the sinking of the Titanic. When he was rescued on the Carpathia, he locked himself in his cabin and didn't come out until they arrived at New York. He was questioned at length about his involvement with trying to convince Captain Edward J. Smith to increase the speed of the Titanic, despite warnings of icebergs, in order to get some positive press. He was branded a coward and shunned from society. He had been accused of abandoning passengers on the ship and escaping in a lifeboat. He was also accused of compromising the safety of the passengers by encouraging the Titanic to speed up. There was an investigation done, and it appeared that Ismay did not influence the captain, and he did in fact help passengers get on the lifeboats. However, due to him being shunned, this deeply impacted him, and he spent the rest of his life in isolation and fell into a deep depression. He was considered a villain of the Titanic sinking, and his reputation never healed. In 1913, he retired from the White Star Line. Thomas Andrews was in the first-class smoking room staring at a painting of a ship on the wall. Astor put his pregnant wife in a lifeboat and kissed her goodbye before it was lowered. She asked for him to accompany her, but he refused and said goodbye for the last time. Isidor Straus and his wife Ida retired to their cabin where they died together. Guggenheim and his valet changed into formal evening wear and went on the deck, declaring, quote, "We are dressed in our best, and we are prepared to go down like gentlemen," end quote. Molly Brown helped load the lifeboats full of passengers and was finally forced on the last lifeboat to leave. She begged to the passengers and crewmen to turn back to help rescue other survivors, but the crewmen refused. They were afraid that they would be swamped by people desperate to survive and would all ended up drowning or freezing to death. At 2:20, the Titanic, now standing nearly perpendicular with the sea, finally went under the surface on April 15, 1912. It is estimated that it took about 6 minutes, traveling about 30 miles per hour, for the stern of the boat to hit the ocean floor. The Carpathia rescued the survivors at 3:30 in the morning after hearing the Titanic's distress call at midnight, and at 4:10, the first survivor of the Titanic set foot on the Carpathia. There were 5 separate boards of inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic. These boards were on both sides of the Atlantic. There were detailed hearings and dozens of witnesses were interviewed. Maritime experts were consulted, and every angle was consulted and investigated, from the officers' and crew's behavior to how the ship was constructed. During the investigation, it was assumed the Titanic had sunk due to the enormous rip in its hull from the iceberg, but as more theories have evolved over the years, one of the biggest theories is the steel on the ship was too brittle for the cold water of the Atlantic, and the steel on the Titanic was lacking magnesium, which would have made the steel more malleable and not as brittle. During the investigation, many passengers testified to the confusion on the ship. There was a general warning sound that had never gone off, and there were several passengers and crew members that were unaware that the Titanic was in danger. There was supposed to be a lifeboat drill, but that was never done, and lowering the lifeboats was becoming haphazard. Many point to Captain Smith's refusal to slow down after warnings of ice to be part of the reason the Titanic had hit the iceberg and sunk. There was also a huge amount of criticism that had been given to the ship, the Californian, as it was less than 19 miles away, and the officers and crew had reportedly seen the distress signals, but ignored them. There was a great deal of misinformation that was floating around after the Titanic had sank. Due to the lack of technology at the time, news moved slowly. Individuals were flabbergasted that the ship sank, as it was believed to be literally unsinkable. Some newspapers even reported that the Titanic did hit the iceberg, but it did not sink, and it was just being towed home with all the passengers on board. I can't imagine the devastation that family and friends would feel at thinking their loved ones had survived, and then later finding out that they had read a load of misinformation. John Maxtone Graham, a naval historian, had compared the Titanic sinking to the story of the Challenger space shuttle disaster that happened in 1986. The same incredulous feeling was felt by individuals who believed that such a sophisticated piece of technology like the Titanic could have exploded and killed its entire crew. Humans have one fatal flaw, and we believe that we are beyond human error and frailties, that our technology makes us invulnerable. But time and time again, that has been proven not to be true. There are several theories as since decades have passed. People believe that there are several omens before the Titanic sank into the sea. The first one is a conspiracy theory that the millionaire J.P. Morgan had planned the disaster so that Benjamin Guggenheim, Jacob Astor, and Isidor Straus would die on board. The theory behind this is that Morgan had initially planned on traveling on the ship, but at the last minute decided not to go. This theory doesn't make sense as there's no real explanation behind how he would have been able to make the ship crash into an iceberg. Also kind of strange that 1,000 other people would have to die just to kill off 3 major players. The reasoning behind it is that they oppose the creation of the Federal Reserve, but it appears that Guggenheim and Astor were fairly indifferent on it, and Strauss supported the idea. There's also a theory that the Rothschild banking family or Jesuits had wanted Guggenheim, Strauss, and Astor dead. The Washington Post stated that the Rothschilds being conspirators is, quote, a centuries-old anti-Semitic trope. The Rothschild family founded banking houses across Europe in the early 1800s, and they have been a favorite target of conspiracy theorists ever since. End quote. Recently, this theory reemerged in connection to QAnon and an alleged secret plot against Trump and his supporters. There's a theory that the Titanic never actually sank and it was switched with another ocean liner from the White Star Line, the RMS Olympic. But Paul Burns, the curator and vice president of the Titanic Museum attractions in Missouri and Tennessee, stated that the theory doesn't make sense. The theory is heavily laden in the idea of insurance fraud. The Olympic had been damaged in September 1911 when it was sailing from England to New York, and it had returned to Harland and Wolff's shipping yard to be repaired. It sailed to New York and back, but it had to be repaired again at the shipping yard in March 1912. The idea is that the Olympic was too damaged to make a profit, and so the ship was switched out with the Titanic so it could be purposefully ditched, and insurance money could be collected. The Titanic's insurance money wouldn't actually cover the Olympic's loss, so this theory, again, does not make much sense. There's also a theory that the Titanic was sunk due to the curse of a mummy that was on board the ship. William Stead, who died on the ship, was a spiritualist, and years before he went on the Titanic, he believed that this curse was causing terrible things to happen in London. The fear lays deeply ingrained with the anxiety that colonists had about the Native Americans' land that they had plundered. The mummy was never identified as having any specific sort of background. Stead told his idea to many passengers and would tell a tale about a mummy's curse. A survivor later came forward and told the story to the New York World, and the media ran wild with it. The month after, the Washington Post ran a headline that said, quote, "Ghost of the Titanic, vengeance of hoodoo mummy followed man who wrote its history," end quote. There was a link to some artifacts that Molly Brown had taken with her on the Titanic as she was delivering them to a Denver museum. There are other versions that the mummy was on board because the British Museum sold it to an American who was shipping it home. The mummy remains at the British Museum to this day, and there is no actual information about the mummy ever being put on a ship. I leave you at the end of part 1. Part 2 will discuss the aftermath of the tragedy and several key players that have had a long-standing impact, not just with the sinking of the ship, but whose influence affected portrayals in the media. I'll see you next time for part 2 of the Unsinkable Titanic. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out our show notes. Transcripts and sources will also be on my website, notyourhistoryclass.com. Researching, hosting, and production and editing is all done by Lauren Powers. Theme song and episode music is done by Mike Myers. You can find him at the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.